Good morning, Shabbat Shalom, and welcome to United Israel World Union. This is our Sabbath morning scripture study coming to you live from St. Francisville, Louisiana. Thank you very much for joining us. We are in class number 27 of our ongoing study through the Pentateuch according to the annual cycle of readings, sorta. In other words, I'm pulling things here and there, making slight adjustments according to the subject matter of what I intend to teach. But this is the third class on the material from the book of Vayikra, the book of Leviticus. Today, I'll be covering material that is found within the fourth and fifth readings, that is Tzara'at and Metzorah. You'll see some Hebrew letters behind my head, and I will explain those shortly. It's a learning prop. See, I'm trying to get to be a better teacher as I get older and more mature, so I'm trying to give you certain visual aids to help you. So the word behind me you will know by the end of this class if you don't already know it. But as far as organization of material, you'll recall that a few weeks ago, I taught a class and I combined material that was from the first two readings of the book of Leviticus. We did Vayikra and Tzav, both of the first two readings. We pulled material from both of those Torah portions, if you will, because I wanted to cover the first 7 chapters which deal with sacrifice and offering. So I condensed 2 into 1. Then I did the third reading. This is now the fourth class, but I'm pulling material from 4 and 5 as far as the numbering of the Torah portions. It just works better organizationally to do it that way, at least in my mind. So this week, according to the cycle, those of you who follow the annual cycle of readings, the Torah portion is called Tzara'at. Tzara'at covers chapter 12 and 13 of Leviticus. It's Leviticus chapter 12, 1 through 13, 59. Now, as we get into this material today, I want to begin with a passage from Leviticus chapter 10. Go with me this morning, please, ladies, gentlemen, boys, and girls, to Leviticus chapter 10. And I want to just begin by saying that in verse 8, what is following is a communication, according to Leviticus 10, from God to Aaron, and by extension, his sons. So here's what he says in verse 10, actually 9b. This is a law for all time throughout the ages. For you to distinguish, you must distinguish between the sacred and the profane, and between the unclean and the clean. And you must teach the Israelites all the laws which Jehovah has imparted to them through Moses. Okay? So what we have here is, in Leviticus chapter 10, Jehovah is telling Aaron that he and his sons have a primary task. Now, the English translation of some of these words we're going to be talking about, but a big part of the role of Aaron and his sons is supposed to be to cause to know, the verb is in the causative, to cause to know a distinction between certain categories. They are to distinguish, to discern between certain categories, and those categories are translated various ways. Ideally, I think you should say between what is holy and common, or what is set apart, what is sanctified, sacred, whatever word you want to use for kadosh, and what is common. Common doesn't mean bad. It doesn't really mean profane. When we think of profane, language has a tendency to change over time. What the word really means is you have certain things which are set apart for sacred purpose, and then you have these other things. They're not bad, they're not ugly, they're not dirty, they're not less, they're just common, they're normal. Okay, so this is one of the things that Aaron and his sons are supposed to distinguish between. And then the other categories are translated variously. I say impure and pure. Some translations say unclean and clean. But I think all of these are grappling with how do we convey exactly what the Hebrew is saying, okay? Now, one thing that we need to know is that Levitical literature, priestly material, these laws often deal with zones of holiness or zones of sanctity or the lack thereof. And we really, in our day and age, these are so foreign to us that I don't think we quite fully understand what these zones of holiness are. So, for instance, when someone says, or a translation says, clean and unclean, it really paints the wrong picture, and I want over the next several weeks for that picture to be evolved into a more biblically oriented picture of what the Bible is actually saying. So clean and unclean is definitely not the way to think about it, because in our language that's taken on something totally different than what is conveyed in these texts. Because the word, for instance, the word that's sometimes translated unclean or impure, the Hebrew is tameh. But the idea about tameh, something being tameh, there's nothing wrong or bad or dirty per se. It's not any of those things. Many of the things which are considered tameh, or many of the conditions, are naturally occurring phenomena. Certain things that are natural in human existence put a person in a state of tameh. And it's not like you go, oh, you're tameh, get away, get away. People have this image that is just this horrifying, get back, get away. That's not really the way it is unless they're approaching a sanctity zone, right? Unless if someone is trying to go to a holy precinct, then you would definitely say, whoa, stop, hold on. You can't come, and here's why. But basically, if someone is tameh, it puts them in a category that precludes participation in certain activities or entrance into certain areas or zones, and that's the basic point of it, okay? You want to make a separation. You want clearly to separate between areas and things and so forth that are pure, sacred, set apart, holy, sanctified, and then you want to take in another group, you want to keep this separate, common things, things that are normal, naturally occurring things. And there are other things that fit into those categories, but that's just the main demarcation. Usually, and almost always, a person or something which is considered tameh, it's a temporary assignment to that category brought on most often by something quite natural, and that person is only tameh, only impure in terms of these zones of sanctity while that condition persists. Once the condition is resolved, the person is no longer considered tameh. Once they have been cleared and they follow certain protocol that are outlined in what we would say is the instruction manual of the priest, what some have referred to when we talk about the book of Leviticus. Leviticus is the Tzara'at Kohanim, the instruction of the priest, or the priestly instruction book. So there are certain steps that a person must go through, often involving the oversight and guidance of the Kohen that they have to follow, and that brings them back into good standing. Here are a couple of examples that come into the reading cycle today. When we open up Tzara'at and we begin to study Tzara'at, there are a lot of rules in there, And what it's primarily concerned with are naturally occurring things, particularly in regards to women. And with women, there are certain things that can put them in this state through no fault of their own. It is a natural, God-designed function of a female. And so, for instance, when a woman goes through a normal cycle, that is one of the things that puts them in this category. Nothing wrong. In fact, it's normal. It's perfectly normal. And then a childbirth, you know, when a person when a woman brings forth a child, there are certain things that are covered in Tzara'at, particularly the amount of time that it takes to go through the process moving back into out of Tameh and into back into full fellowship, if you will. And it's different for boys and girls. The Bible makes a very clear distinction in all of this, and it partly is covered in Torah reading, Tzara'at. In fact, the word Tzara'at, the name of this particular Torah portion, the meaning of which is when a woman produces seed. When a woman produces seed. Okay, so there are four categories. There are four basic categories. People could tweak these and add subcategories, but four categories that render one tameh, or impure, even though that's not quite what we're talking about, but let's go with impure. And that is contact with the corpse of a human, contact with the carcass of an animal. Then you have a third category, which is very detailed, and it deals with fluxes, F-L-U-X-E-S, which is the flow of certain bodily fluids, emissions, and so forth. And I'm going to tell you right now, you study that one on your own. I'm going to leave that alone for right now. I've got other things to cover. But there's quite a bit of literature out there. You can find quite a bit on that if you choose to study fluxes, flows, bodily fluids. And then the fourth category is a special condition known as Tzara'at. Tzara'at. You will see the word above my head. If you remember, you read Hebrew right to left. So we have a tzadi, a resh, an ayin, and a tav. Tza, T-Z, Tzara'at is what we're going to be talking about today. And again, I'm going to be pulling material that is from Leviticus 13 and Leviticus 14 because it deals with this whatever Tzara'at is. And a person who has Tzara'at is called a metzorah. So the mem means one who, or who is Tzara'at. I don't want to give too many verbs in here because we're going to focus on what it means. Now, if in your notes you want to spell Tzara'at and you don't want to try to write the Hebrew letters, although you'll have about an hour if I move my head, you can kind of see the letters and you can write these down in your notes and learn these four letters. Tzadi, resh, ayin, tav. If you want to spell this in English, what we call transliterate, you can do it different ways, but the way I write it is T-Z-A, tza, R-A, ra, and then I put an apostrophe A-T, Tzara'at. I almost laugh because there's a joke that we say, the Cajun people, I've heard them refer to an apostrophe as a comma to the top. So remember that. You learned it here. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to cover material in Tzara'at Metzorah. A lot of times, depending on the way the year falls out, these two Torah portions are combined anyway. This year they weren't. I'm going to do it for the sake of organization. So today's class, I'm going to call Tzara'at what it is and what it's not. Tzara'at, what it is and what it's not. Because the meaning of this word, the cause of whatever it is, and the remedy are all the subjects of great debate. If you do a study and you look from rabbinic literature to academic literature to Google search to whatever it is that you want to search for, you're going to find that there is a lot of disagreement and a lot of back and forth that concerns this subject of Tzara'at. Even within, like if somebody said, well, I'll just go with what the rabbis say. Well, if you go with what they say, which ones is what I would ask, because within rabbinic literature, there's a good bit of discussion and debate about this term, what it means, what causes it, what is the remedy for it. Now, forms of this word in the Hebrew Bible, when translators look at the Hebrew and they're trying to translate it into English, they have come up with various translations for forms of this word. And so you will see quite often in English Bibles, leper, leprosy, leprous, those words associated with leprosy are attached often in translations to the word Tzara'at. But usually in better study Bibles, even if they retain the word leprosy, there'll be a confusing caveat, is what I call it, that says, we use leprosy, but the word doesn't mean leprosy. Now, a person like me thinks, so why use leprosy? Well, it's time-honored in a lot of these translations. People have always thought that Tzara'at earlier, before, let's call it pre-critical study period, they would call it leprosy. But what most of these footnotes will say is, here's what you need to know. Our translation says leprosy, but it's not leprosy. And then they'll usually say what is now known as Hansen's disease, Hansen''S. Hansen's disease is what we now call classical, technical leprosy. That's not what the Bible's talking about. Hansen's disease was not known in biblical times, and the descriptions that we get in the biblical text are not descriptive of what we see in terms of symptoms and so forth for Hansen's disease. You know, it's just not the same. So most translations will say that. Now, even if they do retain leprosy, though, a lot of times they'll just put the footnote and hope, I guess, that you see it. So I want you to know, what they want you to know is that if you see leprosy in your Bible, it doesn't mean leprosy. Now, the JPS, the Jewish Publication Society, which at times takes a lot of liberties with the text and isn't so literal, JPS uses the word, get this, scaly affection. Scaly affection to translate Tzara'at. So when I first started this study this week, earlier in the week, I was really, and of course, like you, I've read these texts for a long time. I've read what the rabbinic literature says about it. I've looked it up online. I've done all this. But I really was looking for solutions to answers to questions that I've always had. I think I came up with some. But when I saw the JPS, my first thought was, I'm not sure I like that. Scaly affection. By the way, affection here isn't what you desire. Like a lot of people desire affection. This isn't that kind of affection. This is not the kind of affection that's defined as a gentle feeling of fondness or liking. That's not the kind of affection. This means that this is some kind of scaly affection, meaning that it affects those that it gets on, or those that are that have Tzara'at. It wants to say that it's a scaly effect, not effect. It's an effect on them. Now, It's an attempt to name something that affects a person. So scaly affection then would be something, according to JPS, they want you to get the idea that it affects someone by giving them scales. But at least the scaly part I have a problem with. We're going to leave affection on the side just for a moment. I dismissed it initially, but I'm going to put it off to the side. I don't think it's perfect, but I don't think it's worth throwing out yet. Now, scaly, on the other hand, I'm going to put in a different category because I want to come back to that. Now, Richard Elliott Friedman, in his commentary on the Torah, which I typically like his translation, the way Richard Elliott Friedman translates Tzara'at is he says, affliction of leprosy. Well, there we go with leprosy again. Okay, so now we got to, of course, he footnotes it, right? He says this is not leprosy, which is technically Hansen's disease. He even goes on to tell his readers a little bit more about Hansen's disease. He says he thinks that, most authorities think, that Hansen's disease showed up in the Near East around the time that Alexander the Great was coming from India. So it's ancient. It hit the Holy Land in an ancient period, the ancient Near East, but it's not in the biblical period. We're talking like the Bronze Age and so forth, the Iron Age. They don't have Hansen's disease. But again, he translates Tzara'at, affliction of leprosy, and we know that leprosy is not right. So why do they use it? A lot of times a translator uses something when they don't know what else to use. That's the bottom line. See you next Saturday. No, so I'm not done. Jacob Milgram is probably the Leviticus guy on the planet right now. He is a brilliant scholar, and this is his specialty. Jacob Milgram is the guy who writes the commentaries. He's the authority on Leviticus. Usually what he says about Leviticus, most people just say, well, Milgram, Milgram's weighed in, discussion's over. So I have a lot of his stuff. So I go to my book on Leviticus by Jacob Milgram, and I open it up, and he calls it scale disease. Scale disease. So again, we have this scale come in, but he uses the word disease for Tzara'at. Maybe we're close. Maybe Milgram is going to put this thing to rest. Now, he says, by the way, he also puts, this is not Hansen's disease. So one thing you ought to get out of this class, if anything, is whatever Tzara'at is, it is not Hansen's disease. So what is it? Is it scale disease? Is that a proper way to describe it? One of the things that Jacob Milgram writes in his book is that he took the text of Leviticus, that all the texts which deal with Tzara'at, and he brought it to a friend of his who is an esteemed dermatologist, and he said, I want you to read this, and you tell me what you think it is. Now, other people have done this, by the way. They've looked at the symptoms that are given in the biblical text, and they've come up with a couple of different options. But my class today is not on dermatology. I'm not a doctor, and I don't play one on Saturdays, so I'm not going to go into that so much, although it's an interesting study. But he came back with certain answers, but again, he decides that it's called scale disease. Now, here, for what it's worth, I have a couple of things to add to this discussion. In my opinion, including the word scale in the name of Tzara'at is too narrow. It's too narrow of a name or a designation. When I see Tzara'at in the text, I don't go scale. I don't say scale disease or scaly affection. I just gave you a couple of examples where brilliant scholars do say that. Now, the reason I don't think it's called scale, or I don't think that's an appropriate name for it, because while the Hebrew word for scale or flaky is a symptom of Tzara'at, it is not the only symptom. I'm just going to take a break and say, some classes are easier to teach and the material is more fun to teach. This is a little bit different. So if you don't enjoy this as much, you have to work through it to get to the next class. No, but the idea though, Tzara'at can't be reduced to the idea of being defined by one symptom of this whatever it is. Because, like I said, scales and flakes, while they are symptoms, it's not the only symptom. And the word that is used for scaly or flaky, which there is a Hebrew word, is not always combined with Tzara'at. If you wanted to be called, let's say that you wanted to translate Tzara'at as disease, and then you would, to call it scale disease, you would need the word scale every time you see Tzara'at, and you don't. And by the way, Tzara'at does not mean disease either. So, scale, in my opinion, is not adequate in the best case, and it's not accurate in the worst case. Disease doesn't really work either. So, if I tell you that the greatest expert on Leviticus calls Tzara'at scale disease, and I tell you that scale doesn't work, and I tell you disease doesn't work, it shows that we have a problem going into this. Now, why does disease not work, in my opinion? Because disease is often associated with humans. When we talk about pathology, the study of human cells and so forth, disease deals with tissue and your body, the human body. But this is not restricted to humans. And this is why I think that doesn't work either. So let's take a look. Let's see which Bible. I'm going to look at the Hebrew and translate it literally, but I want you to go to Leviticus chapter 14. Leviticus chapter 14. I'm going to give you the summary, first off, of the Torah of the Tzara'at. And I'm not going to translate Tzara'at. So the Torah of the Tzara'at, this is the Torah for every mark. Leviticus 14:53. For every mark, in Hebrew it's nagah, of the Tzara'at, and the flaking, natak, nun, tav, kof, and a Tzara'at of the garment, and a house, and for a swelling or a rising, which is nasa, nun, sin, aleph, and a leakage or an oozing, which is samik, pei, het, for a bright spot, bahar, to show in a day of impurity and a day of purity. This is the Torah of Tzara'at. Okay. Now I wanted you to see that when Leviticus, the priestly manual of instruction, goes through from chapter 13 and 14 and covers all these symptoms and diagnoses, methods, and so forth, it describes what Tzara'at does. And I want you to notice that Tzara'at is not restricted to humans. It can be on fabric, material, clothing, etc., and on structures, houses. So whatever this is, now a lot of people say, well, it's like mold. You know how you can get a growth, and so one idea that you can put in your notes is it has something to do with a growth, and we get some indications that that's the case, but based on some of the symptoms. This, I want you to think, have you ever seen these commercials on television where someone says, if you have psoriasis, you might want to talk to your dermatologist about this particular medication, if it's right for you. And then they'll give a long list of the side effects. Well, let me give you the side effects or the symptoms of Tzara'at in my television announcer voice. It might cause a rising in the skin, flaky, peeling, itchy, scaly skin, leaking, oozing from flowing wounds, bright, shiny spots. If these affect you, see your dermatologist. Or in the biblical days, you see the Cohen, you see the priest. And that priest will be able to diagnose whether this raised spot is anything to be concerned with, whether this oozing is anything to be concerned with, you know, because sometimes it might just be a bump. My wife, Bridget, is the one at the house that everybody goes to. Would you look at this? I'm really worried about that. She's like our local Cohen. We don't go to the doctor very often. It's not that we're against doctors. Our son's a doctor. I'm not sure he thinks it's a good idea, but I go to Bridget for everything. Hey, would you look at this? What do you think this is? And she gives me a diagnosis. Well, the diagnosis part is what the Cohen does. Now, what do you call something? Now, I don't think you call it scale disease, because I think scale and disease are both wrong. But what do you call something, Tzara'at, that has the symptoms of a rising or a swelling, flaky, peely, scaly, leaky, oozy, flowing, bright, shiny spot? Now, those symptoms don't have to occur together. It can be some or all. But what do you call it? Because whatever you call it has to capture Tzara'at. And by the way, it's everything I just described on the human body that's not going to look like that. A curtain in your house isn't going to ooze, but will it get something else that gives you that attention? Well, you can read about what those descriptions are, but they're all called the same. Whether it's a house, which is probably made out of stone, even though the Torah is set in a nomadic type setting, you have to assume that this would be talking about houses of the period as well. Now, what's interesting is that the Koran Bible, which I tend to like the English translation better than most. In fact, it's my favorite English translation. If you have to use an English translation, this is the Bible with the best English translation. You know what it does when it gets to Tzara'at? Nothing. It transliterates it. It doesn't translate it. You'll be reading along and it'll say, this is the Torah of the Tzara'at. And you, the reader, are left with, what's a Tzara'at? Well, it is something that affects humans, material, houses. If it's on a human, it causes rising, flaking, peely, skin, leaking, oozing. So to name something, it's important helps us to know the meaning of the thing that we're trying to name. That just makes sense. Again, credit is to the person who tries to name this, and I just happen to look at the screen. People are often, they're putting the word growth, and that's one of the things that comes to mind, but it doesn't quite capture it either, you know. It doesn't capture the full diagnosis, if you will. So if you want to know what it really means, you look at maybe we can find the root word in Tzara'at. Now the root of Tzara'at is Tzadi Resh Ayin, the first three letters behind me, right to left, without the Tav. Tzara. What does Tzara'at mean? Get this. I thought, I'm going to find something here. I have probably, arguably, one of the best libraries for miles and miles. I have a lot of language tools. I loaded up my table. In fact, if you were here, you'd see my table is still loaded up with all these open books. I looked at the linguistic works that I have. Elliott is the Hebrew Aramaic lexicon of the Old Testament, one of the great works. I looked at Brown Driver Briggs, looked at all these because I want to know, what does Tzadi Resh Ayin mean? Because if I can get that, you know, like maybe someone else didn't look at that already. And I open it up, and here's one of the main things that it starts off with. You ready? This is not helpful at all, by the way. Just don't get excited. It says probably a denominative verb from Tzara'at. Probably a denominative verb from Tzara'at. That means that this great linguist tells me that the root, I would suppose is the root, Tzadi Resh Ayin, is actually derivative. It comes from the noun Tzara'at, which I don't know what means. Not a lot of help. But keep reading. You work your way through, even though that brought us full circle, to define a root word by a verb which is unknown meaning is not very helpful. But there were suggestions by other linguists that come up from related languages, okay? So, of course, you have skin problems, but you also get from other languages, other language groups in the ancient Near East, you have words like wound, blow, you know, like a strike, the word interrupt, the word stop, humiliate, humble, throw down, weaken, all of these. Now there is this idea that comes out across the language groups that seems to suggest that this is something which brings low. And I was thinking, what do we think? Have you ever heard somebody, like if they get the flu or something, they say, you know, I've got the crud, or I've got, you know, this really knocked me down. You know, it was really a blow to me. It weakened. I was weak. I was exhausted. So you have to wonder if somehow this idea of Tzara'at is this idea just knocks you down. Now, in some cases, it's going to weaken you. In some cases, you're going to have these humiliating sores and oozing, all kind of, you know, stuff going on. Still not a lot of clarity. So what do I do next? Well, I search for the root. I search for the root word like all of you good Bible students do, and I came up with 66 occurrences. Relax, we're not going through all of them. But here's what I found. Most of these words, because a lot of times if you look up the root word, you can see what is derivative of that root word, and you'll get a hint as to what it might really mean. You know, I'm getting all kind of people proposing things in books and commentaries that don't get me to the root idea. What's the root idea? So as I look through them, I realize that there are basically three things that come from the root Tzara'at. Majority of the words that, the majority of occurrences of the 66, most of them are our word Tzara'at, which is translated wrongly by most. Then we have a proper name, or variations on a proper name, or names that come from Tzara'at, meaning there's someone's name who have the root word Tzadi Resh Ayin in it. Those all come from the same root. And then we have three texts that give something else, and I'm going to get to that in a few moments. I'm going to leave it alone for right now. But there is something else. So here's what we're looking for. We're looking for something affecting people, fabric, and structures. The root word can be used to describe swelling, peeling, leaking, bright spots, discoloration. Now, if we move on, Leviticus 13 and 14 describe, we'll come back to the meaning in a few moments. Leviticus 13 and 14 describe Tzara'at without giving a cause. Really, the cause isn't given. It's not treated according to the text. I'm primarily, stick with me. I know people are saying, oh, what about this, what about that? But just work with me here. Leviticus 13 and 14 don't indicate that it is brought on or it comes on you because of sin or wrongdoing. That's not present in the priestly instructions. There's no indication that a person is going to have to repent or ask for forgiveness. And don't be concerned if you see a chatat offering, because a lot of times people translate that sin offering, but that is not in the case of Tzara'at. I'm not getting into this much today, but do a little bit of research. That's not because the person affected with Tzara'at has committed sin. There's a different understanding and a deeper understanding to the chatat. But be that as it may, the point being there is not an association in priestly literature, Leviticus 13 and 14, that ties Tzara'at with sin. The priest, by the way, this when the priest looks at it, this is a natural phenomenon. It's treated as such. In other words, it's viewed as such, not treated. Remember, the priest does not treat. The priest is not a doctor. The priest is trained to diagnose that Jehovah is the healer. Jehovah is the healer in ancient Israel, okay? You get that? And again, I'm not against doctors. I know a lot of religious people say, well, I'm not going to go to the doctor because Jehovah is my healer. I'm not going to put you do whatever you feel is right, but I encourage people to utilize the gifted people that we have today, and like my son, go visit somebody like my son. A priest's job, the job of a priest, I should say, is to check for, to diagnose, to follow the Torah, to check again, and then once cleared, to follow the Torah, okay? Remember Leviticus chapter 10, verse 10. Their job is to identify, diagnose between what is impure and what is pure. Now we're going to go through a few examples in the biblical text of people who had this, whatever it is. See, I almost said something. So go with me to Exodus chapter 4. Exodus chapter 4. Exodus 4 and we're going to read verse 6, but I want to tell you what leads up to this. God calls Moses, tells him he's going to send him to liberate the people. Moses offers a series of reasons why he doesn't feel he's up to the task. And then he ultimately says, they won't believe me. Like when I go to the children of Israel, they're not going to believe me. And God gives him some signs according to the writer of Exodus 4. And this is where we're going to pick up. Exodus chapter 4, verse 6. And Jehovah said furthermore to him, put now your hand into your bosom. And he put his hand into his bosom. It's like, he's wearing a robe. Imagine this. He's like, reach your hand in your shirt there, Moses. And when he took it out, his hand was diseased, it says, as white as snow. And he said, put thy hand into thy bosom again. And he put his hand into his bosom again. And when he took it out of his bosom, behold, it was turned again as his other flesh. Now, in this particular passage where the word is diseased, in Hebrew it's Tzara'at. So it has Tzara'at in it, but it's saying that he's got this on his hand now. And notice the description. It's Tzara'at kasheleg. Kasheleg means it's tzara'at as snow. As snow. Now, this is a clue maybe. So what do we know about snow? I don't know. I'm in Louisiana. But I've heard that snow is both cold and white. I've seen pictures. But is that what it's describing? Is it white? Could they be talking about snowflakes? So maybe we could get his hand was cold. It was white and flaky. I don't know. Maybe. Maybe that's the reason it's described as kasheleg. Kasheleg. Tzara'at kasheleg. Now, that description is going to come up again. Go with me to the book of Numbers. The book of Numbers chapter 12. Numbers chapter 12. And you know the story in Numbers chapter 12. In Numbers chapter 12, what we have is the story where Miriam and Aaron challenged Moses in a way. And they mentioned, remember the story about the Cushite woman and so forth. Well, let's pick it up in Numbers chapter 12, verse 10. Let's look at verse 9. The anger of Jehovah was inflamed against them, and he departed. And the cloud was removed from the tent, and behold, Miriam was snow white, stricken with Tzara'at. And Aaron looked upon Miriam, and behold, she was diseased. And Aaron said to Moses, Alas, my Lord, I pray thee, lay no sin upon us, for we've done foolishly, we've sinned. Let her not be as one dead, of whom the flesh is half consumed when he comes out of his mother's womb. And Moses cried to Jehovah, saying, Heal her now, O God, I pray thee. Now, this particular text, even though the translation is different, is using the same exact phrase as what we found in Exodus chapter 4, verse 6. Tzara'at kasheleg. Now, you heard me read Tzara'at in this particular text. Tzara'at, Tzara'at. So Miriam also has Tzara'at, and one of the descriptions is that it is kasheleg, as snow. Now, is it white? Is it cold? Is it flaky? And then it goes on. It's very descriptive in verse 12. It's like, Lord, don't let her, it must have been pretty evident pretty quickly. This came on quickly. And so Aaron says to Moses, don't let her be like a baby that's dead. I mean, it's really a nasty description there. But we don't really get a name for it yet. I'm struggling with it. Now go to 2 Kings chapter 5. Now, in 2 Kings chapter 5, we have the story of Naaman. Naaman is an army commander of Syria. And if you recall, Naaman has a Hebrew girl that is a servant in his household, and she has this idea. She really likes Naaman. I think Naaman is a nice guy. She really likes him, and she says, if Naaman could just go to the prophet in Israel, he could heal him of this leprosy, is what the English says. Well, he's got Tzara'at, whatever it is, and the little girl wants him to be healed of it. I say little girl, Na'ara. So she wants him to go. So he goes, and you remember the story. It's kind of back and forth. And he's like, wait a minute, you want me to dip in the nasty Jordan? I've got better rivers in Syria. I mean, if you need me to dip in water. And I've seen places in the Jordan that I say, the Mississippi's just as good as that. So, but the idea is that he doesn't really think that that's going to bring the healing properties. But eventually, he does do what he's told by the prophet, and guess what? He's healed. Now look at chapter 5, verse 14 of 2 Kings. Let's go back to verse 13. His servants came near. This is after he kind of bows up and says, well, I don't want to dip in this dirty water. They spoke to him and said, my father, if the prophet had bid you to do some great thing, would you not have done it? How much rather than when he says to you, wash and be clean? So I think reason comes over him. He's like, you're right. It's not, how hard is it? I go in the water. It either works or it doesn't. And so he went down, dipped himself 7 times in the Jordan, according to the saying of the man of God, and his flesh was restored like the flesh of a little child, and he was clean. So again, we have this image of clean and good, like a childlike flesh. So whatever Tzara'at is, it takes away that youthful, childlike, fleshy appearance, at least when it happens to people. Now, what's interesting about this story, if you recall, is that he tries to give a gift, and the prophet says no, and Gehazi, the servant, he decides, you know what, I'll take a gift. So he chases the guy down, and he says, I'll take that present you were going to offer. And then look down at chapter 5 of 2 Kings, verse 27. When the prophet Elisha hears about it, he says this, let the disease of Naaman cleave to you and to your seed forever. And he went out from his presence, stricken as white as snow. Now again, it's Matzorah Kasheleg. So they're cheating a little bit in these passages when they say white as snow. I'm not suggesting that it's not implied, but Matzorah is tied to my word Tzara'at, which I don't think means white. We do have a Hebrew word, lavan, which is associated with whiteness. Maybe Tzara'at is somehow tied to white. I don't know. It's not attested in any ancient source. Again, very difficult. Can you imagine a disease just called the whiteness? All right. Now, one example of horizontal reading. Go with me to 2 Kings 15. 2 Kings 15. Now this is an exercise I'm going to work through quickly with you here, but I want you to do this on your own. This is your homework. Write these texts out or copy and paste them from a program and then print them out. But I want you to look at this in verse 15. 2 Kings 15. In the 27th year of Yoravam, king of Israel, Azariah, king of Amaziah, king of Judah, began to reign. 16 years old was he when he began to reign, and he reigned 52 years in Jerusalem. And his mother's name was Yecholiahu of Jerusalem. And he did that was right in the eyes, in the sight of the Lord, according to all that his father Amaziah had done, except that the high places were not removed. The people sacrificed and burned incense still on high places, and Jehovah smote the king so that he was afflicted with Tzara'at. Your translation may say leprosy. It may say scale disease or something. But he says, until the day of his death, and dwelt in the house of immunity, and Yotam, the king's son, was over the house, judging the people of the land, and the rest of the acts of Azariah and all that he did, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Judah? So Azariah slept with his fathers, and they buried him with his fathers in the city of David, and Yotam his son reigned in his stead. Now some of you know one of my favorite studies is to read horizontally 2 Kings and the account given there, and the account given in Chronicles. Let's see what Chronicles says about this. Go with me to 2 Chronicles chapter 26. 2 Chronicles 26. and we're going to begin in verse 1. A lot of reading here. Bear with me. 26 verse 1. Then all the people of Judah took Uzziah, notice the name difference, who was 16 years old, and made him king in the place of his father Amaziah. And by the way, name differences aren't a problem because we have, sometimes people call it a regnal name, a name that's given at the coronation. Some use that, whatever. Okay. He built Elliott and restored it to Judah after the king slept with his father. 16-year-old Uzziah, when he began to reign, he reigned for 52 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Yecholiah of Jerusalem. He did that which was right in the sight of the Lord, according to all that his father Amaziah had done. And he sought God in the days of Zechariah, who had understanding in the visions of God. And as long as he sought Jehovah, God made him prosper. And he went forth and warred against the Philistine, broke down the wall of Gath, and the wall of Yavne, and the wall of Ashdod. And he built cities about Ashdod and among the Philistine. And God helped him against the Philistine and against the Arvim, who dwelt in Gurbaal and Maunim. And Amunim rendered tribute to Uzziah, and his name spread abroad to the entrance of Egypt, for he had strengthened himself exceedingly. Moreover, Uzziah built towers in Jerusalem at the corner gate, at the valley gate, the angle of the wall, and fortified them. And he built towers in the desert, dug many wells, for he had much cattle, both in the lowland and in the plains. He had farmers and vine dressers in the mountains and in the Carmel, for he loved the soil. I love that line. He just loved the soil. Moreover, Uzziah had a host of fighting men who went out to war by bands according to the number of their account by the hand of Yeiel, the scribe, of Maaseiah, a ruler under the hand of Hananiah, of one of the king's captains. The whole number of the heads of the father's house and the mighty men at arms was 2,600, and under their hand was an army, 307,500, who made war with mighty power to help the king against the enemy. Now you see, I'm going through a lot of this text. I could keep going and going. A lot more detail here in Chronicles. Okay, now, verse 16, but when he was strong, in other words, once all this success, it says his heart was lifted up to his destruction. For he transgressed against Jehovah his God. He went into the temple of the Lord to burn incense upon the altar of incense. And Azariah the priest went in after him with 80 priests of Jehovah who were men of valor. And they withstood Uzziah the king and said to him, "It's not for you, Uzziah, to burn incense to Jehovah, but for the priests, the sons of Aaron, who are consecrated to burn incense. Go out of the sanctuary, for you have trespassed. For it shall not be for your honor from Jehovah God." Then Uzziah was angry. He had a censer in his hand to burn incense. Now remember what happened? We did this last week. This isn't a good thing. I can see where this is going. And while he was angry with the priest, Tzara'at broke out on his forehead before the priest in the house of Jehovah beside the incense altar. And Azariah, the chief priest, and all the priests looked upon him, and behold, he was diseased in his forehead, and they thrust him out quickly from there. And he himself hastened to go out because Jehovah had smitten him. And Uzziah the king was afflicted with Tzara'at to the day of his death. He dwelt in a house of separation, being diseased, for he was cut off from the house of Jehovah. And Jotam his son was over the king's house, judging the people of the land, the rest of the acts, etc. Now, the difference being, as you noticed, in Kings it just says, and Jehovah smote him basically with Tzara'at. Well, it gives a little bit more detail in Chronicles, and sometimes it's the other way around. You have to read them horizontally. But what we know is that Uzziah made a mistake, and he brought on divine displeasure, which was put forward in the form of Tzara'at. Tzara'at can affect humans, cloth, house. Sometimes it's because of sin. Divine displeasure, sometimes it seems to be just a natural phenomenon. Someone gets tzara'at on their person or on their things. Aside from physical symptoms, the root seems to suggest, beyond the visible things, a weakening, like you're knocked down. Disease, affliction, and plague don't quite cover tzara'at because it affects people and objects, and I think that perhaps that's why the JPS called it affection, because it has adverse things that it does to people. It affects people and things. Now, as I begin to tie things together, go with me to Deuteronomy 7:20. Deuteronomy 7:20, and here's what I want to look at. In 7:20 it says this. Jehovah your God will send a plague against them until those who are left in hiding perish before you. Now, in context, this is talking about Israel's enemies. And God's going to send a plague, the JPS says, among the people, and basically it's going to win over on behalf of Israel against these people. Now, the translation, the translator is trying to figure out a word that's very similar to the one behind me, except, watch this, except instead of Tzara'at, Tzara'ah. Same first three letters, the same root, but instead of a tav, it's off of this root here. It says Tzara'ah. JPS translates this as a plague, similar to the way they translated Tzara'at, a plague. Now, can a plague affect people and objects? Okay, couldn't it? Now, the reason, if you look at this, you say, yeah, but there's another translation. If you look at the footnote here, it says plague, but the footnote says others hornet, comma, meaning of Hebrew uncertain. Hornet. Now, is it a hornet that's going to, let's look at this. I mean, the Lord God will send a hornet. In fact, in Hebrew, it's not plural. It's not like the hornets, like, so many of them. You picture people running and getting stung and trying to get out. And this is what, this says, the Tzara'ah. What does that mean? Well, in context, if you look at verse 15, right above that, Jehovah will ward off from you all sickness. He'll not bring upon you any of the dreadful diseases of Egypt, about which you know, but he'll inflict them upon your enemies. And it talks about how he's going to wipe out these other people. And then verse 20 says, the Lord your God will send a plague or an affection, or is it hornet? Okay, well, let's see. Now, if you look at Exodus 23, there are only 3 verses that mention this. Exodus 23, verse 28. Let's look at that. Let's start in Exodus 23, verse 27. And it says, I will send forth my terror before you, and I will throw into panic all the people among whom you come, and I will make all your enemies turn tail before you. I will send a plague ahead of you, and it will drive out before you the Hivites, the Canaanites, the Hittites. I will not drive them out before you in a single year, lest the land become desolate and wild beasts multiply to your hurt. I'll drive them out before you little by little until you've increased and possessed the land. I'm going to send a plague ahead of you, he says. The Hebrew word is tzara'ah. I'm going to send tzara'ah, hatzara'ah, ahead of you, and it's going to do this to these people. Now, the strange thing is, again, it's tied to the same root word. So the question is, the translator, the footnote says, others hornet, meaning of Hebrew uncertain. Is it a hornet that's going to chase out the Hivites, the Canaanites, and the Hittites? You know, is there such a hornet infestation in the land of Canaan that this kind of, and remember it says it's not going to do it all at once. This is going to be gradual. Whatever Tzara'at is, whatever it is, it's going to take some time, but it's going to get to the point where these people are going to, you know, I got to get out of here. Is that hornets? Do they just kind of show up every now and then? One more text, Joshua 24. Joshua 24 and 12. Joshua 24 and 12. And it says, let's look at 11. Then you crossed the Jordan and came to Jericho. The citizens of Jericho, the Amorites, the Perizzites, Canaanites, Hittites, Girgashites, Hivites, the Jebusites fought you, but I delivered them into your hands. I sent a plague ahead of you, and it drove them out before you, just like the two Amorite kings, not by your sword or by your bow, but by a plague. Or footnote says, see the note at Exodus 23:28, which says, others hornet. Now, I ask you, do we think that hornets chased out the Hittites, Girgashites, Hivites, and the two kings of the Amorites gradually over time? Or is the JPS onto something here? Is the JPS saying it's tied to the same root as Tzara'at? Tzara'at is some kind of plague or something that's going to bring havoc. And we know it's a problem in the biblical time. There's a lot of literature about dealing and diagnosing with this and preventing its spread. Now, what do you think? Okay. Whatever this is leads to this gradual chasing out. Is it a hornet, a stinging insect, or could it be something more difficult to define, brought at times by divine power? Just like God inflicted, if you will, certain people with Tzara'at. Is that what these three texts are talking about? Again, 66 times in Scripture, aside from the few proper names, it always deals with this Tzara'at. One ancient text, very similar to Deuteronomy 7:20, does exist, and it has an interesting reading. Rather than, it looks like Deuteronomy 7:20, it's almost exact. There are a couple of differences, but it's an ancient text, in my opinion. And instead of Tzara'at, which Hebrew is uncertain, it says Tzara'at. Now, that manuscript, by the way, is known as the Shapira manuscripts in fragment G and line 6. I'll put up a link later to an article that I wrote if you want to get into that and really dig in. Doesn't matter whether or not someone thinks that there's anything of interest with the Shapira manuscript. But I can tell you that it takes away that problem, that it puts you in the same. You know that whatever Tzara'at is, that's what God is going to bring on these people in the land. The affection, sometimes affecting humans. I think I like that. I think that Tzara'at is kind of captured, if you will, by this phrase that's used by the JPS, the affection. That's not a good name for it, but it's the closest I can come because it can affect people. It can affect garments. It can affect houses. It's not really a disease so much because it affects things that aren't human. That's my understanding. Sometimes it's brought on because of divine displeasure, and sometimes by natural phenomena. The affection was real to the people who wrote the Bible. Its diagnosis was prescribed in the Torah of the Tzara'at. Its meaning, its cause, and its remedy are still a matter of debate. Now let's pray this, that whatever the affection was, whatever Tzara'at was, that it stays far away from us, our people, and our stuff. Whatever it was, it's very, very bad, affecting everything it touched in a bad way. Now, may each of you affect everyone and everything that you touch in the coming week, but for the good. Shabbat Shalom, Shavua Tov, have a beautiful week, and I'll see you here. Same time, same channel, United Israel World Union YouTube channel. Have a blessed week.